The evening air buzzed with excitement as families poured into the town park, setting up lawn chairs, picnic blankets, and coolers stuffed with snacks. Children ran in circles, waving sparklers that hissed and crackled, while music boomed faintly from nearby speakers. It was the 4th of July, and the whole town seemed to be celebrating. Flags fluttered, burgers sizzled on grills, and the sky stretched above in a deepening shade of twilight. At the edge of it all, James Carter sat stiffly on a bench, his shoulders hunched, a bottle of water sweating in his hand. He watched the scene unfold in front of him, but it felt as though he were viewing it through a fogged window. Something real, but distant. James had been home for 2 years now, ever since his last deployment in Afghanistan. But some part of him had never really left the desert. "Isn't this nice?" Sarah, his younger sister, chirped beside him. She beamed as she watched families spread out in anticipation of the fireworks show. "It's been forever since you've come out for something like this." James forced a small smile and nodded, though his chest felt tight. Sarah meant well. She was always trying to pull him out of the shell he'd retreated into since coming home, encouraging him to meet people, to find a hobby, or simply to enjoy life again. But James didn't know how to tell her that moments like this didn't feel like joy to him. They felt like something dangerous, something loud and unpredictable. He glanced around the park. Kids shrieked in delight as they chased one another, their sparklers leaving glowing trails in the darkening air. Adults laughed and clinked beers, their faces relaxed and carefree. The hum of normalcy, of life going on, surrounded him, and yet James couldn't feel it. Instead, he felt the tension in his shoulders, the way his pulse ticked a little faster with every sharp crack of a sparkler igniting nearby. His eyes kept darting toward the tree line, as though he expected something, or someone, to emerge. He reminded himself it was just a park, just a celebration. There was no danger here. Sarah nudged him gently. "Hey, you okay?" Her voice was soft, careful, as though she were afraid of pushing too hard. "Yeah," James said quickly, clearing his throat. "I'm fine." "You'll love the fireworks. They're always the best part," Sarah said, her face lighting up. "I used to love watching them with you when we were kids." James nodded, his jaw tight. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to be the brother she remembered, the one who laughed freely and loved holidays like this. But he wasn't that person anymore. The fireworks she spoke of with such joy were exactly what made his chest squeeze with dread. "It's just fireworks," he told himself. "They're safe. It's not the same." But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first loud boom shattered the night, James's breath caught. His vision blurred, and in a split second, the park began to fade. The laughter of children and the music from the speakers warped into something else entirely. Shouts, explosions, and the thudding of boots on sand. The past was pulling him back. The first firework exploded in the sky, a bright burst of gold that fizzled into tiny streaks of light. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, but James barely heard them. His shoulders tensed, his fingers clenching the edge of the bench as though he could anchor himself to it. A second firework shot upward, its whistling sound piercing the air before it burst into a loud boom. The vibration seemed to echo through his chest, rattling his bones. The noise hit him like a wave, and suddenly he wasn't at the park anymore. The desert heat pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. Sweat dripped down his back, soaking into the heavy Kevlar vest strapped to his chest. The air smelled of dust, fuel, and something burning, something he didn't want to identify. James crouched low in the sand, gripping his rifle as he scanned the horizon for movement. The sun blazed overhead, a blinding white disk, and all around him, the distant booms of mortars sent plumes of smoke into the sky. "Carter, stay low!" a voice shouted over the crackle of the radio. James turned to see his unit scrambling for cover, their silhouettes barely visible through the dust storm kicked up by an explosion. Adrenaline surged through him as he sprinted toward a crumbling wall, the weight of his gear pulling at his shoulders with every step. Another explosion rocked the ground behind him, and he could feel the heat lick the back of his neck. He dove for cover, his hands scraping against the gritty sand. "Where's the fire coming from?" someone yelled. "South side, 300 meters out," another voice barked back. James peeked over the wall, his pulse thundering in his ears. The enemy was dug in, their positions invisible except for the occasional muzzle flash. The air crackled with gunfire, the sound blending into one relentless roar, shouting, screaming, the smell of smoke growing thicker. And then, boom! James! Sarah's voice cut through the fog, sharp and urgent. James, are you okay? James blinked hard, the world snapping back into focus. He was sitting on the bench at the park, but his chest was heaving, his shirt damp with sweat. The fireworks continued, bright streaks of red, blue, and white splitting the sky. Each one ended in an ear-splitting crack that made him flinch. He rubbed his palms against his thighs, trying to steady his breathing. James, Sarah's face was pale, her hand gripping his arm tightly. I'm fine, he managed, though his voice sounded far away even to himself. Just need some air. Before she could respond, James pushed himself off the bench and walked quickly toward the edge of the park. His vision swam, the cheering crowds blurring together as he passed. He needed to get out, to find someplace quiet, someplace safe. Each step felt heavy, his legs shaky as though they no longer belonged to him. When he reached the tree line at the far end of the park, James stopped and leaned against the trunk of an old oak tree. He closed his eyes, taking in deep, ragged breaths as he tried to drown out the explosions still echoing behind him. But it was no use. The sounds followed him, clawing at his mind, dragging him back to a place he didn't want to go. The shouting grew louder, overlapping and frantic. James pressed his back against the wall, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. Dust and debris filled the air as another mortar landed nearby, shaking the ground like an earthquake. "Carter, cover the flank!" someone shouted. He turned, his heart racing as he scanned the chaos for his brothers in arms. That's when he saw him, Rodriguez, his closest friend in the unit, sprinting across the open ground. His helmet was tilted back, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Move!" James shouted, but Rodriguez didn't hear him. He was too focused on reaching cover, too focused on surviving. And then, boom! The explosion sent Rodriguez flying, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. James froze, the world tilting on its axis. His ears rang, the sound muffled and distant, as though he were underwater. Everything moved in slow motion, the dust hanging in the air, the distant shouts of his team, the sharp crack of gunfire that never stopped. "Rodriguez!" James heard himself scream, his voice raw. He scrambled out from behind the wall, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past him, the orders being shouted into the radio. His only thought was to reach his friend, to pull him to safety. When he finally reached Rodriguez, he dropped to his knees, his shaking hands fumbling to check for signs of life. Rodriguez's eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. James pressed his hands to the wound, his voice breaking as he muttered, "Stay with me, man. You're okay. You're okay." But he wasn't. The blood seeped through James's fingers, warm and sticky, no matter how hard he pressed. "Carter, we have to move!" someone screamed. "Not without him!" James yelled back. "He's gone! We have to go now!" "James!" The voice jolted him back to the present like a splash of cold water. James opened his eyes and realized he was sitting in the dirt beneath the tree, his back pressed against the trunk. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps, his pulse still pounding in his ears. Sarah was kneeling in front of him, her face filled with worry and fear. "You're scaring me," she said, her voice shaking. "What's happening? Talk to me." James looked at her, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what it felt like? The noise, the smells, the memories that clawed their way out of the darkness whenever he let his guard down. How could he make her understand that he was still there, no matter how many miles or years separated him from that battlefield? "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's face softened, and she reached out to take his hand. "You don't have to be sorry," she said gently. "You're not there anymore, James. You're here, with me." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to close his eyes and let her words pull him out of the storm raging in his head. But even as he sat there, the distant pops and booms of the fireworks continued, each one a reminder that he would never truly leave that place behind. From across the park, a small boy's voice rose above the noise. "Mommy, look at that one!" he shouted, pointing at the sky. James glanced up, following the boy's outstretched hand. A firework exploded high above the trees, a massive burst of gold and silver that lit up the night like the sun. For a moment, the sky shimmered, and the light was so brilliant it chased away the darkness. The crowd gasped in wonder, their cheers echoing through the park. James stared at the fireworks, his breath catching in his throat. In that moment, something shifted. Something small but real. The explosions were still there, but for the first time, he could see the beauty in them. They weren't the mortar shells of Afghanistan. They were just fireworks, safe, harmless. His grip on the tree loosened, and he let out a shaky breath. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, offering him a small smile. "It's okay, James," she said again. "You're safe. You're here." The words hung in the air, a quiet lifeline. James didn't answer, but this time, he didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to watch the light fill the sky. The fireworks finale roared above, a brilliant storm of light and sound cascading across the night sky. The cheers of the crowd rose in waves, their voices mingling with the echoes of the final booms that vibrated through the park. For James, the noise wasn't gone, but it was manageable, a dull roar rather than the sharp, piercing reminder of war that it had been before. For the first time, he could see the fireworks for what they were, a celebration, not an attack. Sitting under the oak tree, his back pressed against the rough bark, James let his shoulders relax slightly. His breathing had slowed, the hammering in his chest finally easing as he watched the final streaks of gold and silver fizzle into darkness. Beside him, Sarah stayed quiet, her presence as steady as a lighthouse in a storm. She didn't push him to speak, didn't press for answers he wasn't ready to give. She just sat with him, and that was enough. "Are you okay?" she asked after a moment, her voice gentle. James turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "I'm better," he replied honestly. His voice was still rough, but it was clear and steady. He gave her a faint smile, one that felt strange, but right on his face. "Thanks for being here." Sarah smiled back, though her eyes were still tinged with concern. "You don't have to thank me. I just wanted you to try, you know? I didn't want you to feel like you had to hide forever." James nodded slowly, her words sinking in. For years, that's exactly what he had done. Hidden. He'd hidden behind closed doors, behind strained smiles and quiet avoidance. He thought staying away from things that reminded him of the war, crowds, loud noises, fireworks, would keep him safe. But in the end, it hadn't. The memories had found him anyway. They always did. "I thought avoiding it would make it easier," he admitted softly, staring at the dark horizon. "But it doesn't. It just gives it more power." Sarah didn't respond right away. She just listened, letting James put words to something he hadn't spoken aloud before. "Out there," James continued, his voice steady but distant, "you learn to react to everything, every sound, every movement. Your brain rewires itself to keep you alive. You don't think, you just do. But when you come home," he paused, searching for the words. "When you come home, your brain doesn't know how to switch off. It's like you're still there. The war doesn't end. It follows you." Sarah's expression softened. "That sounds exhausting." James let out a quiet laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Yeah, it is." They sat in silence for a moment, the echoes of the fireworks fading into the quiet hum of crickets and distant voices. James could hear families packing up their things, kids laughing as they chased each other through the grass, and parents calling for them to get in the car. The world was moving on around him, as it always did. But something had shifted. For once, he didn't feel like he was frozen in place. When they finally stood up to leave, James realized how exhausted he was. Not from the noise or the memories, but from facing it all. It was a different kind of tired, one that came after a long, hard fight. He felt like he'd taken a step toward something, toward himself, maybe, toward healing. As they walked back toward Sarah's car, a few people nodded politely at James as they passed. Maybe they noticed how pale and strained he'd looked earlier. Maybe they didn't. Either way, it didn't matter. Sarah walked beside him, her pace matching his, like she understood how much energy every step took. She didn't rush him, didn't ask for anything more. At the car, James paused before getting in, his hand resting on the door. He glanced back at the park, where only a few families remained, their voices carrying faintly through the night. The fireworks had ended, but the sky still seemed to glow faintly, as though the light had left something behind. "What is it?" Sarah asked softly. James shook his head. "Nothing, I didn't think I'd make it through tonight." He turned to her, his face thoughtful. "But I did." Sarah smiled, and this time, it reached her eyes. "Yeah, you did." As they drove home, the quiet of the car wrapped around them like a cocoon. James leaned his head back against the seat, staring out the window as the dark countryside passed in a blur. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, but it wasn't the same. There was a strange lightness to it now, as if he'd put down some invisible weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. "James?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft but curious. "Yeah? Have you ever talked to anyone about this? About how you feel?" James turned his head to look at her. For years, the idea of talking about it, about the war, the things he'd seen, the things he couldn't forget, had felt impossible. Even now, it wasn't easy. But tonight had taught him something important. Not facing it didn't make it go away. It just made him feel alone. "I think I'm ready to try," he said quietly. Sarah's face brightened, though she kept her voice calm. "I think that's a good idea. You don't have to do it alone, James. We'll figure it out together." James nodded, a small knot in his chest beginning to loosen. "Yeah, together." When they reached Sarah's house, the lights were still on, spilling a warm glow onto the front porch. James stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The echoes of the fireworks were gone now, replaced by the soft chirping of crickets and the distant rustle of trees. Sarah joined him, her keys jingling softly in her hand. "You sure you'll be okay?" she asked, watching him carefully. James smiled faintly. "Yeah, I'll be okay." For the first time in a long time, he believed it. As Sarah disappeared inside, James stayed on the porch for a moment longer, staring up at the night sky. It was quiet now, the darkness undisturbed, but he could still picture the fireworks bursting across it, bright and loud, but fleeting. They were just light, he realized, just noise, nothing more. He thought of Rodriguez then, his friend who hadn't made it home. James closed his eyes for a moment, bowing his head slightly. "I'm still here," he whispered softly, as though saying it to himself, to Rodriguez, and to the night all at once. "And I'm trying." The words felt like a promise. Finally, James stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The war wasn't over, not in his mind. It would always be a part of him. But for the first time, he felt like he could face it. Not run from it, not hide from it, but face it. And that, he realized, was how healing began. One moment, one step, one fireworks show at a time.